Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you all. This time covering Mary Renault's Alexander trilogy, which is the three books that cover the life of Alexander the Great. That are, I guess I would say, if you didn't want to read any one of these, they're sort of standalone in the sense that while they cover the the whole history, and there are some characters who overlap between them. In a sense, anyone who is familiar with the historical or familiar enough with the historical material, there's not really anything in any of these that is the kind of deviation from history that would mean you need to read the historical novel instead of reading the whatever kind of other historical background. Which I guess I bring up because it speaks to, I think, part of why, part of my feelings about it, which is that all of the books are really great. The second book in particular is really incredible. The Persian Boy is really well done. The first half of the Persian Boy is, I think, not as good as the second half, but the second half and really the last kind of third or so is pretty incredible, and the it in some ways gets to the element of, I would say, if you aren't going to read all three books, you could just read The Persian Boy and get a really excellent standalone historical novel of Alexander the Great instead of a trilogy of novels about Alexander the Great. Mary Renault wrote a number of other things, has a series on Theseus that she wrote, that is kind of a sort of exploration of sort of Bronze Age culture in some ways. This one is not fantastical really at all. There's some kind of character experience of fantastical elements, I guess you might say. Characters who, in states of, say, like inebriation, or who are kind of in the midst of a religious festival or something like that, have some sort of sense of being a part of something subtly supernatural, I guess you might say. Um, Very much kind of in the way that the actual like histories of the period record these kind of semi supernatural elements, the idea of like omens and stuff like that as part of the reality that these characters live through, I guess, is probably the way to put it. So the first book, Fire from Heaven, is Alexander's childhood up until basically the point where he is just about to become the king of Macedon. It ends with Philip II's assassination. Which I guess I'll say, I started off with that. I'll say sort of spoilers for all of the things that happen in this book that are also spoilers for historical events that happened more than 2,000 years ago. So, I guess if you are interested in reading these and don't want to go in knowing the events of the history beforehand, feel free to skip from here. But otherwise, for everyone else who either already knows something about the history or is interested in the history kind of independent of the historical fiction on some level, the first book covers basically the period of Alexander as a young boy, 3 or 4 years old, I think, in the first scene, maybe three. Or maybe four. I don't know. I don't really know with kids. I think he's like a toddler, which is, I think, like three. Um, and all the way up to he is, I think, 20 um, by the end of the first book. The second book covers kind of on from there, although it starts a little earlier, but it follows a different character, a young man named Bagoas, who we first see him as a essentially a teenager, I guess, a young side for teen, maybe tween is what I don't know. He's like 12 or 13 at the start of the book and is a Persian, and he is sort of involved in the Persian side of things. He ends up being a part of Darius's court and then becomes part of Alexander's court after Alexander has conquered the Persian Achaemenid Empire. And his perspective, of course, is fairly different than all of the characters in the first book, who are basically all Macedonian or Greek, right? All of these figures from Alexander's boyhood, his parents, all of his friends who go on to become powerful generals in his armies and then in his empire, and then eventually, of course, many of them become the rulers of these successor states or successor armies at the very least. All of these characters who will go on to become important figures in the kind of history of Alexander the Great's reign, who we're seeing kind of the sort of prologue version of all of that. By the Persian Boy, most of them have, of course, become important. And so we see a number of characters who make reappearances and kind of a different perspective on them, because the first book is mostly told either from Alexander's perspective or from Hephaestion's perspective. Hephaestion, maybe? Hephaestion's perspective, I'll say it that way, with a couple of other smaller kind of viewpoints every once in a while in there. But the second book is all from Bagoas's perspective, and so it's a kind of a different view on a lot of the some of the similar events and a lot of a different perspective on many of the characters. And then we get to kind of late in the Persian Boy. Alexander has reached has reached India and has done all of these crazy things. Has done all of his kind of adventures along the coast of what is nowadays Iran, and has come back all the way to the kind of heartland of the Persian Empire. And he, Hephaestion dies, and then Alexander dies shortly after. And that's where the Persian Boy ends, and then where the funeral games starts up. The first couple of scenes of funeral games are a little bit before the actual events of Alexander's death, but from new perspectives again. We've kind of shifted away from Bagoas by the time of funeral games, although he's there and doing some things. But suddenly a lot of our perspective goes to a whole bunch of other characters, some of whom have been important before. So like Ptolemy is, of course, one of the major successors and is a figure of, a point of view character in a lot of the scenes in Babylon. But then we also have characters like Perdiccas, who we haven't seen that much of. And then gradually a number of other characters that we also kind of have been sort of from the fringes, haven't seen that much of. So, like, Eurydice and Cleopatra. Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, and Eurydice, Alexander's his half sister's daughter, I guess is how it works out. It's a complicated thing, but she ends up being married to Alexander's half brother, who has a some type of serious mental issue. Seems to be like mentally disabled on some level. Has not fully grown into all of his mental faculties the way that you would hope, but has been picked as a potential new king for the Macedonian kingdom that is now huge, obviously, and controls this immense territory. And the Macedonians believe in essentially kingship by acclamation, the idea of the army, that is all of the men of fighting age who are rich enough to own arms, are allowed to be at basically the big meeting and choose from the potential claimants who is going to be king. So, for instance, Alexander's father, Philip II, was not in line necessarily to be king, was part of the royal family. But when his uncle died, who was the king, his uncle's son was not of age, was a child, and so the army chose Philip instead. They chose him first as regent, rather than as king right away. But he eventually became king, basically off of that kind of power grab, and so that's part of what goes on at the funeral games at the start, is all of this struggling over who is going to be the next king, because Alexander is dead and he has not really left a definitive heir. And famously, he there are different interpretations of his last words, but the way that the book deals with it is this idea that supposedly what he says in the kind of poetic version of his last words, when asked who should take over his kingdom, that he says, to the strongest, which is very similar in Greek to the name of one of his generals, Craterus, who is away from Babylon at the time. I guess Craterus, I don't know how you pronounce. Anyway, there's a kind of question there about the veracity of Perdiccas's response about what it is that Alexander said on his deathbed, and this eventually, leads to the chaos of the wars of the successors. All of these characters, many of whom are still pretty young, because Alexander died pretty young. But many of these men are, young and talented, and have marched back and forth across the known world, and have fought more than their share of battles already, but are none of them still kind of at the heights of a man like Alexander. And that's part of the how the story ends up developing, is this idea of them all being talented in some ways, but none of them really able to secure the entire empire and become the new king of a kingdom of Macedon that is not just Macedonia, but is also basically like all of the Persian territories as well. And so this the breakup of the empire. Eventually, you get the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty and the Antigonids in Macedon itself, and all of the the breakup of these successor kingdoms, and then plenty of other smaller successor kind of sub states in various places. Anyway, which it's an interesting. There's a sort of point that is made right near the end that I think is a really interesting kind of conclusion to the whole saga. Is this idea of Ptolemy as the only one of Alexander's direct successors who dies peacefully. Basically, that he takes over his one little slice of the empire, takes over Egypt, and hides out there and is able to rule it apparently effectively, and become king and establish a dynasty, and dies in his bed, unlike all of these other men who have attempted to control a lot more territory and become, much more powerful in some ways, and much closer to the stature of Alexander the Great. And that's really interesting in particular because it seems like Alexander himself would not have put a very much of a premium on that based on the way he lived his own life. And so there's a kind of an interesting, transition between the ethos of these different men there also, which I think is a really powerful note to end the whole series on. And all of that has been sort of about what happens in these books, which you can totally find out just by, reading your landmark Arian, or reading whatever other sorts of historical resources there are. None of that has really gotten into why I think these books are so good, which is that they are really well written. The characters are really well rounded, and just a real masterclass in historical fiction that takes these historical personages that we obviously cannot really know in a lot of ways, right, that our knowledge of them has to be limited, but we have some assumptions about what sort of a person they would have to be, partly just in order to do the things that they did. In particular, with Alexander himself, Fire from Heaven, I think, is a really interesting book that is basically why how does somebody like Alexander come to be? How does somebody with this kind of immense capability and ambition, and who believes that he can take what is a powerful kingdom, but still a fairly small and fairly resource poor kingdom by comparison with the Persians, and take on the most powerful empire in their part of the world and win and conquer it and do all of these things, right? How does someone get to the point of doing all that and then not being willing to stop? That Alexander feels the need apparently to keep going further to the east and take all of this other territory, and that he gets all the way out to like the Indus River Valley and wants to go further, and imagines that he's going to keep going all the way until they get to the ocean that's at the end, right? The end of the world. Which makes Fire from Heaven really interesting because obviously all of the like detail of who Alexander was as a person kind of has to be conjecture on some level, but it is conjecture founded upon the historical details that have been left to us and our, understanding of what different people or different persons are like, and how they have lived, both kind of people that we're familiar with and historical figures that we know about from some details. And it makes for really compelling historical fiction. And I guess that's sort of the place to summarize all of this, is that I think this is really good historical fiction that is very fun and really well done, and totally worth your time if you are into historical fiction. Even if you are not as into historical fiction, I think this is a really a high bar for almost any piece of writing in some ways, and is a lot of fun and totally worth checking out if any of this sounds interesting to you at all. It's a really um, impressive set of books, I think, a really excellent set to read. So anyway, that is going to be all for me for today. Mary Renault's Alexander Trilogy. All of them are on Kindle and easy to find there. They're also, I think, still, if they're not in print, they're pretty easy to find, is what I found. And they're not too long. I think 300 to 400 pages for each of them. So yeah, totally worth checking out. Go read Mayor Renault's Fire from Heaven and The Persian Boy and Funeral Games, and enjoy those books because they're really good and worth enjoying. But that is going to be it for me for today. Thank you so much for watching or listening. Leave a comment down below if you have read this series of books, or if it sounds interesting to you, or if you're just sort of interested in Alexander the Great stuff. I guess you could leave a comment about that too. But otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.